My name is Natalie Brooks. I'm 32 years old, and at 6:13 on a gray Tuesday morning, after 22 hours inside an emergency department, I came home to discover that my entire relationship had been packed into 7 black garbage bags. I remember the exact time because my car clock seemed painfully bright against the darkness. We had been short 3 nurses overnight. A trauma surgeon had nearly walked out halfway through a case because something was happening with his marriage. One patient arrived with part of his arm packed in a cooler. Another coded twice before we managed to stabilize him. I had eaten 1 protein bar since the previous morning, and during the drive home, I kept thinking about 3 things: leftover pasta, a hot shower, and sleeping until someone declared me legally dead. Then my headlights swept across the porch. 7 bags sat beneath the front window. My television was sticking awkwardly out of one, wrapped in an old bath towel. My college sweatshirt was hanging from another. My laptop case was on the ground beside them. Even the ceramic mug I kept on my nightstand had been tossed outside. There was a crack through the handle that hadn't been there before. For several seconds, I genuinely thought we'd been robbed. I ran toward the front door with my medical bag still hanging from my shoulder, but there was no broken lock, no shattered glass. The door opened normally. Carter's mother, Diane, was sitting at our dining table drinking coffee. Not frightened, not confused, comfortable. She glanced up from her tablet and said, "You still owe us $15,000 from the wedding fund." Then she looked back down. That sentence did something strange to me. It didn't make me angry immediately. I was too tired for anger. It just seemed absurd, almost theatrical. Carter and I weren't even married yet. His parents had given us money toward deposits and planning nearly 2 years earlier, announcing repeatedly that it was their gift because they were blessed to help us begin our future. Apparently, gifts in the Hale family could become debts whenever convenient. My phone vibrated before I could speak. Carter had texted at 5:48 that morning, while I was treating a stabbing victim. "We're decluttering for mental clarity." That was all. 3 years together, reduced to 6 words and 7 garbage bags. I walked back outside without asking where he was. I sat in my car and locked the doors. My hands started shaking against the steering wheel. Carter had gone nearly a year without holding a steady job while he reconsidered his direction. I had paid the mortgage. I had handled utilities. I had covered his student loan payment twice when he said money was tight. I had worked double shifts while he took weekend wellness retreats with friends because, according to him, stress was interfering with his creativity. Through all of it, his parents somehow spoke to me as though I were the unstable one. Diane once described medicine as a respectable service career, while asking whether I had ever considered doing something more entrepreneurial. I drove back to the hospital parking garage and slept in my car, not because I had nowhere else to go. My parents lived 40 minutes away. I could have called coworkers. I could have checked into a hotel. I stayed because something inside me knew that if I went anywhere while I was furious, I might still be thinking like Carter's girlfriend. I needed a few hours to think like Natalie again. At 9:01 the next morning, I walked into the bank. I separated everything that legally belonged solely to me. I removed my paycheck deposits from shared accounts, froze cards issued under my name, and placed restrictions on the investment account I had funded almost entirely through my salary. I contacted the company handling the house documents and made sure nothing involving my ownership interest could be changed without proper authorization. Then, at 10:34, sitting in my car outside the bank, I emailed an attorney. I wrote 4 words: "I need to leave him." At 11:42, Carter's older brother Mason texted me, "Did you just empty the family trust?" I stared at the message and almost laughed. There was no family trust. Not one connected to me anyway. There was an investment account Carter's family loved, referring to as though they had somehow built it. Every meaningful deposit had come from my paychecks. Carter had contributed occasionally, during the rare stretches when he was employed, but his parents had never placed a dollar into it. I didn't answer Mason. Carter could explain it to him. The first 2 nights, I stayed at a roadside motel 2 counties away. The vacancy sign flickered outside my room. The wallpaper was peeling near the bathroom door, and everything smelled faintly of old carpet and bleach. It was still more peaceful than my house had felt in months. Nobody left passive-aggressive notes beside the sink. Nobody played meditation podcasts at full volume while refusing to speak to me. Nobody stared across dinner because I had supposedly brought hospital energy into the room. I checked my phone once a day. Carter's messages began carefully. Can we talk? Then, let's be adults about this. Then, I didn't expect you to react this dramatically. By the second day, the tone changed. Natalie, I need access to the account. Another arrived 20 minutes later. You're sabotaging both of us. And finally, my mom thinks you need to start acting responsibly. That one made me laugh aloud in the motel room. Responsibility was apparently working 22-hour shifts to keep our bills paid. Responsibility was paying for groceries while Carter spent 3 months developing a mindfulness podcast that recorded exactly 4 episodes. Responsibility was staying quiet, while his father made jokes about doctors being high-income employees instead of real wealth builders. But responsibility apparently did not include asking your girlfriend before putting her belongings on the porch. On the 3rd day, I formally began the separation process. My attorney also revoked permissions Carter had accumulated over the years involving accounts and documents. Looking through the paperwork was humiliating in a completely different way. I could see every moment when I had chosen convenience over caution, because I thought trust meant never protecting yourself from the person you loved. That evening, I went to my parents' house. My mother opened the door, saw the duffel bag over my shoulder, and stared at me for maybe 2 seconds. Finally, she said, behind her, Dad was already putting clean sheets on the guest bed. Neither of them asked what happened until I was ready. Carter arrived the following afternoon. My mother spotted him pacing across the porch before he knocked. He was wearing gray sweatpants and one of those oversized hoodies he used whenever he wanted to look wounded rather than responsible. His hair was messy. His eyes were red. For half a second, seeing him like that hurt more than finding the bags. He told me he had made a mistake. He said Diane had gotten into his head. He said everything had spiraled. He said the bags were supposed to represent temporary space, not a breakup. He insisted we could still fix things without attorneys. Then I told him I wasn't coming back. Something changed in his face. The softness disappeared so quickly it frightened me. If you do this, he said quietly, my mom can tell the police about the jewelry. I looked at him. What jewelry? He hesitated. The necklace you took. That was when I understood he hadn't come to apologize. He had come to see whether I was still afraid of him. I stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind me. You mean the necklace you pawned 2 months ago? Carter went completely still. I told him the receipt was in my car. His signature was on it. So was the pawn shop's security footage showing him handing the necklace across the counter. He had told me at the time that he needed cash for a surprise he was planning for my birthday. My birthday had come and gone. There had been no surprise. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he whispered, You went through my things? No, I said. You left the receipt in my glove compartment. His expression changed again. Not guilt. Calculation. That frightened me more. My mother opened the front door behind me. Carter, she said calmly, leave. He looked at me one last time and walked down the driveway. 2 hours later, his father called. He said the family needed to meet because there were misunderstandings that required correction. I told him I wasn't interested in corrections anymore. I was interested in endings. He said they were coming anyway. And by sunset, Carter's parents were standing on my parents' porch holding a leather folder containing what they apparently believed would put me back in my place. They had no idea I had one more secret. For weeks, Carter had been meeting Maya Sloan, a woman from his yoga studio. What his parents didn't know was that Maya wasn't just another woman. She was his ex-girlfriend. And I finally had proof. Carter's father arrived first, stepping out of his SUV in a navy golf jacket like he was heading into a private club meeting instead of confronting the woman his son had thrown out of her own home. Diane followed with the leather folder pressed against her chest, and Carter stayed inside the passenger seat for almost a minute before finally getting out. My mother opened the door before they could ring. Nobody invited them inside. Carter's father started talking while he was still climbing the porch steps. He said this had gone far enough, that relationships weren't something mature people simply abandoned when things became difficult, and that I was behaving impulsively because I was exhausted from work. Then came the line I had heard from him in a dozen different forms over the years. Adults face adversity instead of running from it. I almost admired the confidence it took to say that after his son had packed my belongings into garbage bags while I was saving lives at work. Diane opened the folder and pulled out a document. She called it a reconciliation agreement. According to the paper, I would return to the house, resume covering the mortgage and household expenses, restore Carter's access to the financial accounts, and agree to relationship counseling with someone their family had already selected. In exchange, his parents would waive the supposed $15,000 debt from the wedding fund. I didn't even touch the document. I asked Diane whether she remembered writing me an email 2 years earlier, saying the money was a gift. Her expression shifted for half a second before smoothing back into that practiced calm. Carter's father said semantics weren't the point. I told him semantics become extremely important when lawyers get involved. Then I looked directly at Carter and said the relationship was over. Carter finally stepped closer. "You're really doing this?" he asked. He sounded genuinely stunned, which almost made me angrier than if he had shouted. "You're really going to throw away everything we built?" I looked at him and realized how perfectly he had reversed the story in his own head. I hadn't put his belongings outside. I hadn't threatened him with fabricated theft accusations. I hadn't secretly pawned his mother's jewelry. And I certainly hadn't been meeting an ex behind his back. "I'm not throwing away what we built," I said. "I'm leaving what you destroyed." His father immediately tried to interrupt, but I kept looking at Carter. "Should we talk about Maya now? Or do you want to explain that part to them yourself?" The silence was instant. Diane turned toward her son. Carter's father frowned, as if the name meant nothing. Carter's face went pale. Maya Sloan had been Carter's girlfriend before me. He had always described their relationship as ancient history, something messy and completely finished. But 3 weeks earlier, I had noticed her name appearing repeatedly on our shared phone bill late at night. Then I found messages on Carter's tablet, not because I searched for them, but because he had left the conversation open beside the grocery list. Most were harmless enough if you wanted desperately to believe them. Coffee, yoga, catching up. But one message from Carter read, "Natalie's working again Friday. Same place." Another from Maya said, "You said you'd figure things out with her first." I had taken screenshots and said nothing. Until that moment. Carter's father turned toward him. "Who is Maya?" Carter muttered that she was just a friend. I asked whether he normally told friends that he missed the life they used to have together. That was enough. Diane stopped defending him and started staring at him in a completely different way. Carter immediately turned on me. He said I had invaded his privacy. He said nothing physical had happened. He said he had been confused because I was never home. That one landed harder than I expected. I had been working constantly because he wasn't. Apparently, the hours I spent paying for our life had become evidence that I had neglected him. My father stepped beside me and said quietly, "You have 1 minute to leave my property." Carter looked at me like he expected me to stop my father. I didn't. He told me I would regret being this cold. He said I was destroying a family. I asked him if he wanted me to show his parents the pawn receipt too. That ended the conversation. Diane's eyes snapped toward Carter again, and this time I saw something almost like fear. My mother opened the door wider, not to let them inside, but to make it clear the conversation was finished. Carter's parents walked back toward the SUV without another word. Carter lingered near the porch for several seconds. "I thought you loved me," he said. I answered, "I did. That's why this took so long." Then he followed them down the driveway. The silence after they left felt different from the silence I had lived with during the final months of our relationship. There was no punishment inside it, no guessing what I had done wrong. My father handed me a beer and disappeared into the garage. My mother put chicken in the oven and asked whether I wanted rice or potatoes. I almost cried over that question. Not because of the food, but because it required nothing from me. No emotional performance. No apology. No explanation. Just rice or potatoes. I chose potatoes. The following morning, I drove to my attorney's office with every document I could find. Buried in an old email chain was exactly what I remembered. A message from Diane and her husband describing the wedding money as our gift to support your future together. My attorney smiled when he read it. "Keep this," he said. "They just solved one problem for us." We also reviewed the investment accounts, mortgage records, utilities, and payment history. The numbers were brutal in their simplicity. Nearly everything substantial had come from my income. Carter had contributed here and there during periods when he was working, but nothing remotely resembling the equal partnership his parents kept describing. 2 nights later, at 2:03 a.m., the security system at the old house sent an alert to my phone. Backdoor movement. I opened the camera feed expecting to see someone trying to get inside. Instead, Carter was standing barefoot on the back steps. He didn't force the door. He didn't touch the windows. He just sat down. For almost 20 minutes, he stared at the ground with something small in his hands. I couldn't tell whether it was a key, a photograph, or just his phone. A month earlier, that image might have destroyed me. Now I watched without moving. There was sadness, yes, but there was also a strange distance. Regret didn't erase choices. Loneliness didn't transform cruelty into love. I forwarded the footage to my attorney and deleted it from my phone. The next morning, I started applying for jobs outside the state: Oregon, Colorado, Vermont, travel contracts, temporary rotations, anything that came with distance. One hospital in Central Oregon needed an ER physician for 6 months and included housing. Population under 10,000. The recruiter described it as quiet, cold, and isolated, like she was warning me. It sounded perfect. 4 days later, they offered me the position. Carter called the night I booked my flight. I answered because some part of me wanted to hear what happened when manipulation ran out of new words. He asked whether I was actually leaving town. I said yes. He asked where. I didn't answer. Then his voice softened. "I thought you'd fight harder for me." For several seconds, I stared through my parents' kitchen window at the dark backyard. "I did fight," I said, "for years. You just assumed I would never stop." He went quiet. Then he said, "You're burning everything down," I answered. "No, Carter. You already did. I'm just refusing to live in the ashes." I left before sunrise 3 mornings later. My mother gave me a thermos of coffee. My father had checked my tires, oil, and brakes, even though I hadn't asked. At the door, he looked at me and said, "Don't come back just to prove anything." That sentence stayed with me through every mile west. Somewhere past Nebraska, Carter started texting again. "Are you really gone?" Then, "You erased everything." A few hours later came another message. "You told my parents about the jewelry, didn't you?" I still didn't answer. Then he made his final threat. "If you talk about the jewelry, I'll tell everyone about Daniel from the hospital. You know exactly what I mean." Daniel Reeves was a married trauma nurse I had worked beside for years. Our supposedly scandalous connection consisted of shift swaps, emergency procedures, and once splitting a stale vending machine sandwich during a 16-hour shift. Carter had been trying to turn him into evidence of an affair for nearly a year. I saved the text and forwarded it to my attorney. But while packing, I had found something far more damaging than Carter realized. Not one pawn receipt, but several, covering 9 months. Jewelry, a watch, antique silverware, items I recognized from his parents' collection. That weekend, from my tiny studio above a pharmacy in Oregon, I scanned every receipt and sent them to Carter's father. No accusation, no explanation, just evidence. 2 days later, Carter called 7 times within an hour. Then someone called from a blocked number. I ignored all of it. The studio had squeaky floors, a hot plate, one suitcase, and an air mattress, but it belonged entirely to me. For the first time in years, quiet didn't feel like rejection. It felt like ownership. About 2 weeks into the new job, I walked past the bathroom mirror after a night shift and stopped. I looked different, though nothing about my face had changed. My shoulders weren't tight. My jaw wasn't clenched. I looked calm. That was when I finally understood the irony. Carter thought putting my belongings outside would make me panic and come crawling back. His family thought money could force me into obedience. Instead, they had removed the last excuse I had for staying. And exactly 1 month after I left, while snow blew sideways across the parking lot outside a small Oregon diner, my phone lit up with Carter's father's name. He called once, then twice. On the third call, I answered. His first words were not an apology. They were, "Natalie, we need to discuss keeping certain things private." Carter's father didn't ask how I was doing. He didn't ask whether the move had gone well or whether I was safe. He opened with the language of damage control. "Natalie, we need to discuss keeping certain things private." I sat in my car outside the diner with the heater running and watched snow collect along the windshield while he explained that the situation with Carter had become complicated. Diane was distraught. Carter was apparently having a difficult time. The discovery of the pawn receipts had created tension inside their family, and some of the jewelry had belonged to relatives who were now asking uncomfortable questions. He said they wanted to avoid unnecessary embarrassment. Then, with the same polished tone he had used when trying to force me back into the relationship, he offered me what he called a financial gesture in exchange for discretion. I almost admired how quickly their morality changed once the secret hurting their reputation belonged to their son instead of me. "No," I said. He went silent, perhaps expecting negotiation. I repeated it. No money, no agreement, no silence. That was when his voice hardened. He said I was being vindictive. He said disappearing to some backwoods hospital didn't make me morally superior. He accused me of trying to ruin Carter because the relationship had failed. Then he brought up maturity again, telling me that a responsible woman would have stayed and handled things face to face instead of running away. I laughed quietly and told him he should have thought about face-to-face conversations when his son put my possessions into garbage bags and left them outside before sunrise. I reminded him that Carter had threatened to accuse me of stealing jewelry that Carter himself had pawned. I reminded him that his family tried to convert a written gift into a debt the second I stopped paying their son's expenses. There was no response to any of that. Instead, he asked whether I really intended to go through with the separation permanently. The question was so absurd that I had to look at the phone to make sure I had heard correctly. "It's already being finalized," I said. He sounded surprised, which told me Carter had probably kept more from them than I realized. For years, that family had operated under one basic assumption. Nobody ever truly left. People fought. People threatened. People punished each other, but eventually everyone returned to their assigned role. Mine had been simple. I was the reliable one, the exhausted one, the one who solved the financial emergency, took the extra shift, covered the payment, absorbed the insult, then came back the next morning and did it again. Leaving hadn't just disrupted Carter's relationship. It had disrupted an entire system built around my willingness to keep rescuing him. I told his father something I had never managed to say while I was still inside that family. I'm not just leaving Carter. I'm leaving all of it. The guilt, the money, your constant little tests, the way every favor becomes a weapon later. I'm done being told I should feel grateful while paying for everything. He tried to interrupt, but I kept going. "You called me family whenever you needed something. The second I said no, I became selfish. That isn't family." He said I was twisting things. I told him maybe that was what he needed to believe. Before hanging up, I added, "Tell Carter I hope he finds someone who thinks chaos means passion, because I don't anymore." Then I ended the call before he could answer. The next morning, my attorney emailed me the final documents. Everything was processed. The property restrictions were in place. Financial separation was complete, and Carter had chosen not to challenge any of the major filings. His lack of resistance surprised me at first, but eventually I understood it. Contesting the separation would have meant discovery. Discovery would have meant account statements, pawn records, messages with Maya, and possibly sworn questions about where the jewelry money had gone. Carter loved controlling the story. A courtroom would have taken that control away from him. Life in Oregon became ordinary in ways I had forgotten ordinary could be. I worked brutal shifts, but when they ended, I went home to silence instead of another emotional emergency. The studio above the pharmacy eventually became too small, so I rented a one-bedroom apartment with tall windows and a tiny balcony overlooking a parking lot bordered by pine trees. Nothing about it was impressive. I loved it immediately. I bought mismatched furniture from secondhand stores, replaced the air mattress with a real bed, and hung exactly one picture on the wall, a photograph my father had taken years earlier of the ocean during a family trip before Carter entered my life. A month later, I visited an animal shelter because one of the nurses at work wouldn't stop sending me pictures of dogs. I told myself I was only looking. 40 minutes later, a mutt with one crooked ear had fallen asleep with his head on my shoe. His file said he had been returned twice because he was too energetic. I understood something about being rejected for taking up too much space. I named him Chance. Every morning at 6, he started scratching at the bedroom door, like we had signed a contract. We walked to a coffee stand 3 blocks away where the barista eventually learned my name and his. It was a ridiculous little routine, and somehow it felt more intimate than most of the life Carter and I had built together. My parents checked in every few days. My mother never asked whether I missed him. My father never asked when I was coming home. Instead, they sent ordinary messages, photos of the garden, complaints about the neighbor's leaf blower. My mother asked whether Oregon grocery stores sold decent tomatoes. My father sent me a picture of a wrench he thought I had left in his garage. Their refusal to turn my breakup into my entire identity helped more than either of them knew. I told them I might come home for Christmas. Maybe. They said they would keep the guest room ready but wouldn't be offended if I didn't. About 2 months after I moved, I heard from Maya. Her name appeared in my message requests one night after work. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. She said she hadn't known Carter was still fully committed to me when they started talking again. According to her, he told her we were essentially separated already and that I stayed at the house only because of finances. I didn't know whether I believed every word, but screenshots she attached showed that Carter had been telling different versions of our relationship to both of us for months. In one message, he told Maya I was emotionally absent. In another, he said he felt trapped because I controlled all the money. The irony almost made me laugh. I had never controlled his spending. I had simply stopped funding it after being thrown out. Maya apologized. I didn't blame her, but I didn't invite her into my life either. I told her I appreciated the information and hoped she stayed away from the situation for her own sake. Her final message was short. I already did. Apparently Carter had tried to restart things with her after I left, but once she learned about the jewelry and the lies, she ended contact. For a strange second, I felt sorry for him. Not enough to want him back. Not enough to forgive what happened. Just enough to recognize that a person can spend years manipulating everyone around them until one day there is no one left to manipulate. 3 months after the morning with the garbage bags, the hospital offered to extend my contract for another 6 months. They also offered relocation assistance if I wanted to stay permanently. I didn't answer immediately. For the first time in years, not knowing exactly what came next felt exciting instead of frightening. I started running again. I cooked actual meals. I slept through the night more often than not. Sometimes I still woke up expecting tension, the sense that I had forgotten a bill or failed some invisible emotional test. Then Chance would snore from the floor beside my bed, and I would remember where I was. The last message I received from Carter arrived 2 weeks after my contract extension. One sentence. Do you ever miss me? I read it while standing in line for coffee. There was a time when those 5 words would have wrecked my entire day. Instead, I locked the screen, ordered my drink, and took chance outside. I never replied. Silence had once been Carter's favorite punishment. Now it was simply the absence of obligation. Sometimes, late at night, I still remember that first morning, the cracked mug, my television wrapped in a towel, 7 garbage bags lined across the porch, and Carter's message about wanting mental clarity. For months I thought the cruelty of it would always be the thing I remembered most. It isn't. What I remember now is sitting in my car afterward and realizing, even before I could admit it, that something had finally ended. Carter thought throwing my belongings outside would make me panic. His family thought freezing me out would force me back into line. Instead, they accidentally handed me the cleanest exit I had ever been offered. Carter wanted mental clarity. In the end, I found it too. Just not in the way he expected.